So since then, it's been a beautiful friendship where I've learned a lot more about Clark and his story, which was actually in the first time I met him. So I wanted to introduce Clark as an individual who is very community minded. And it's a fascinating story of how he met the Chabad in Flagstaff and how he's gotten involved in that community. And because of that, in many other communities. So without any further introduction, Clark is an American Airlines pilot. I kept that out of the emails. Active, meaning he still works for American Airlines. His wife as well as a commercial pilot. And I'm going to turn the mic over and spotlight Clark so he can share his story of where he found meaning and purpose and faith in a very difficult and challenging story. So here you go, Clark.
Okay. Let's see if I can get everything to gallery. I think we're good. Can everybody hear me? Just nod? Okay. So my name is Clark Crawford. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm married to my wife, Susie. We've been married 25 years. We both met in the Air Force where we were pilots. She flew refueling tankers, and I was an F-16 pilot for about 10 years. We got out of the Air Force and went to the airlines, and she went to United. I went to American, and we thought we'd be pretty safe there, keep it split between two companies in case anything ever happened. Well, on September 11th, we were the two airlines that got hit. And I actually was flying that morning and was scheduled to go to Dallas. And we actually think I had about 6 of the terrorists on my airplane. Mine was the same type of airplane they used to go into Tower 1 and the Pentagon. And I'd actually flown the flight from Boston to the West Coast just a few weeks earlier. And one of my friends had just left that airplane off when the terrorists took it. So right after that, my wife saw everything was going down the tubes for the airline. She'd always wanted to be a veterinarian before she went to the Air Force. So she went back, took some classes to make sure she was back up to speed on things. She was a physics major to begin with. And she got into University of Wisconsin, and we moved to Wisconsin for her to take a leave from United and go get a doctorate. Well, when we got there, I had grown up in Phoenix. I had been a commercial pilot since my senior of high school. I was a little bit of an overachiever. I had my commercial pilot's license before I had my high school diploma. I finished up and I put myself through Arizona State, was a Russian language major, and put myself through school crop dusting, hauling skydivers, delivering airplanes, anything for $1 to pay for school. When we got to Wisconsin, I was flying for American out of Chicago. I looked around at all the corn everywhere, and I went, "Where are all your crop dusters?" And they said, "We don't have any here." I thought, sounds like an opportunity. So right before the season started, I went out, I bought an airplane. I went and talked to a few farmers, thought I might have some customers. We'll see how it goes this year. It went crazy. I paid for the airplane in 11 days. I bought a second airplane. I paid for it in 6 days. The next thing you know, I had half my Air Force buddies flying for me in between flying for the airlines. Business was going great. We got done. We decided we wanted to come back out west. Once my wife got her doctorate, we came back out to Arizona. I moved all the airplanes out. Everything was going fantastic. One morning, I took off from a little strip just south of Buckeye, Arizona. It was the 11th flight I'd had for that day. Everything was going fine. Well, just as I broke ground, the propeller speed control failed. The propeller oversped and the engine disassembled itself in flight. Unfortunately, I only had about 400 feet of runway left. I put it back on the ground, but there was nowhere to stop. I looked at it and immediately thought, this is gonna hurt, and it did. As I went off the end of the runway, the left wheel found a little hole in the desert, went down, sheared off the left landing gear, went down on a wing, pulled out a fuel line, and I got 80 gallons of gas dumped in my lap, and it ignited. Luckily, I had a helmet on and a visor down, all the great training from the Air Force. And I tell people that You know how you look at the bottom of a match and the flame and it's blue? Well, I remember looking at that blue flame out of my visor as it melted into my face. And this is where the microphone melted into my mouth. And I had a pretty serious situation on my hands. I was in the middle of the fire. There was no time for anybody to get there. So I actually pulled myself out of the fire, put myself out. And one of my Air Force buddies was there. He was the next guy to get checked out because now the business was going so crazy. I didn't have time to fly anymore, hardly. I was running the business. I was doing the marketing. I was talking to the customers. I was dealing with the FAA. I was dealing with all the leases. And I had all the joys of being a business owner. This was my morning out to go fly where I got to do the fun stuff while everybody came to work. But now my buddy made it down to me and he said he'd already called 911. I said, that's great. I said, now do me a favor, call him back, tell him I need a helicopter. I need to go to the Maricopa County Burn Center. And I need you to cover me up with a blanket because I'm going to be in shock in a few minutes. Now, Gumby and I had served together in Germany, a couple other places, and I had been one of the training officers, so I had taught all of the combat first aid and things you do once you got shot down. I didn't think this was going to happen this morning. So he called back. He said, I've got the helicopter on the way. He covered me up with a blanket. I said, now you got to elevate my feet. We got to get some more blood flow to my head. And I thought, my wedding ring. My hands are going to be swelling up because I now had 3rd and 4th degree burns on 40% of my body. I said, I need you to pull off my wedding ring because I don't want him to cut it off. He said, it looks like it's going to hurt. I said, yeah, I know, just do it. I put my hand up and I knew I was in real trouble then because when I put my hand up for him to pull it off, all of the skin was hanging off of my arm and it was black. So my good friend, and that takes a good friend to reach into that mess, he pulled off my wedding ring for me, put it in his pocket and said, I'll give it to Susie when I see her. I said, thank you. He said, we both had enough friends that had been killed in accidents in the military. I said, do I still have a nose left? Is it burned off yet? Do I still have lips? Because that always goes first. He said, yeah, you do. He said, but it's going to leave a mark. I don't think it's going to buff out. So I remember the helicopter showing up and I remember them trying to put a tube down my neck. Didn't work. And I remembered the helicopter lifting off and heading towards the hospital. And then I remember going to sleep. Well, while I was asleep, I had a lot of dreams. At one point in time, I've talked to a couple other people who have been out for a while. One friend I've talked to said he thought he was at a Boston Red Sox game. He was from Boston, and he just couldn't see up over the edge to see the game and thought he was on some kind of stretcher at the game. Well, I thought I was on a hospital ship. The strange thing was, I'm not Jewish, and everybody on the hospital ship was speaking Hebrew. Well, when I finally woke up from this long sleep that I thought was only a day or so, I asked my wife, have you called the company? Have you told them I'm not going to be there tomorrow? She said, when do you think it is? I didn't know. So I said, when is it? She said, the accident was the middle of October, or she said it was the middle of August, and we're almost done with October. You've been asleep for 2.5 months. I said, wow, I was all afraid of things like, am I going to have surgery? And she said, you've already had 14. I said, am I going to have blood? Because I was afraid about things like AIDS and things like that. And she said, you've already had so many leaders, we can't count. She said, luckily, all your buddies from all your years of serving the country have showed up. She said at one point in time, we had over 40 people in the waiting room waiting to get in. They came from all over the world, donated blood, spent time with her, helped take care of things. And when I woke up, I still had friends there, and there was a long road ahead. I was bandaged from my waist to top of my head, just little slits for my eyes, and my arms and hands had taken the worst of everything, especially on top. Basically, what they had to do was take all of my skin from my lower body, shave it off like you're at a deli with that machine that they slice the corned beef with, and then they sewed it back onto my upper body. So now when my shoulder itches, I don't know what it is. It could be athlete's foot. I don't know where the skin came from half the time. Sometimes you can look at it and go, I think that came off your leg. Yeah, that looks like the right piece. But anyways, I'd been asleep so long, they had to teach me how to walk again. And then they transferred me finally from intensive care to a rehab hospital where I spent another few months with friends coming daily to help out with things while my wife was still working. When I got out of the hospital, they said there was nothing else they could do for me. I had 14 surgeries. They said they had no other ideas what to do. I'd never fly again. I'd never hold a medical certificate from the FAA. And I was done. I needed to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And oh, by the way, you're addicted to morphine, OxyContin, a bunch of other painkillers, because they had to do that to keep my heart from crashing while I was asleep all that time when they were doing all the surgeries. So he brought me home. I was not functional, as they would call it. I couldn't dress myself. I couldn't feed myself. I couldn't go to the bathroom by myself. I had an aunt come from back east. My Aunt Ima came and stayed with me for about 3 more months till I got to the point where I could at least go to the bathroom and put pants on with a drawstring and dress myself. At this time, my aunt was 77 and she went home and she was wonderful the whole time. So now I was at the point where I was still addicted to things for the pain, which was still severe. I had grafts failing still all over my face and my arms. I was bandaged still everywhere. I was bleeding through the bandaging. Well, my aunt was there when I first got home. I had this idea that if I sit here on the couch for the next 15 years, I'll go mad. So I thought, I've got to do something. I'm going to learn how to speak Hebrew. That's it. And everybody said, where did that come from? I've always had this draw. I've always wanted to. So I got in the phone book. I couldn't find a Jewish community center here. I found this thing called Shabbat. So I dialed up the phone. Well, at that time, I didn't dial up the phone. My arms didn't work too good. So I dialed the phone like this and then put the speaker on. And then I leaned over and I was able to leave a message for this rabbi who called me back a few weeks later. He was on vacation. So he calls me back and he asked me what my name is. And I tell him, and he says, are you Jewish? And I said, no, but I want to learn to speak Hebrew. He said, did one of my friends put you up to this? And I said, no. So he said, tell you what, come on in. He said, I think I've got somebody, come talk to me. We'll see what we can do. So I came in and met Rabbi Dovey up here when we were still in the old building. And I sat there in his office and I oozed and bled all over one of his chairs. And he just kept looking at me, shaking his head. And he said, I can't believe you want to do this. But he said, I'll call this lady. She helps bar mitzvah boys out. We'll see if we can get you to where you can read and speak a little bit. So, well, I want to do a lot more than that, but let's get started. He said, by the way, he said, does all that stuff hurt? And I said, oh, yeah, it hurts. It hurts a lot as I'm, like I say, oozing all over the chairs in his office. And he said, I'm teaching this class on Wednesday night for this thing called JLI. He said, I think you'll really enjoy it. He said, it's called Towards a Meaningful Life. And there's this book you need to read by this guy named Menachem Mendel Schneerson. I went, what else have I got to do? I just want to learn how to speak Hebrew, but I've got time to read books too. So I read the book and it was fantastic. I came to the classes. I don't think I've missed one now in 10 years. So we continued with this and I started learning to speak Hebrew and read Hebrew. And some of the only texts I had was I got on this Shabbat website and I found this daily Parsha and I started to read that. And then I got working with my Hebrew teacher. And after a few weeks, she went on vacation. back to South America. Had nothing else to do because I was literally trapped on the couch. I had to have help to stand up. I couldn't go to the bathroom by myself at this time. I couldn't dress myself. All I could do was punch on my iPad through the bandages and operate the keyboard. So I got on Craigslist Tel Aviv while my original tutor was on vacation. And I looked for Hebrew tutors. And I found one that would Skype. Her name was Lerone Ribikoff. She was in the IDF. I left her a message. She called me back a couple days later. And everyone else that looked at me usually thought I was some reject from a horror picture. I was in real bad shape. It was so bad that at one point in time, right after, and this is 6 months later, I'd gone to the gym and I finally was at the point where I could put my pants on by myself. So I thought, I'm going to go take a shower tonight and not go home all smelly. So I went in and I got my shirt off, and a guy was in there with his kids, and the kids started crying. And I thought, this is kind of an adult area. If your kids are going to kind of act up, maybe you should not bring them in here. Well, then I realized they were crying because they were looking at me, and I looked at myself and I went, I look really bad. I'm scaring and what it was is I was scaring the kids, and that's why they were crying. So I put my shirt back on and went home smelly, as I did for a while longer. But originally when I met Lerone 6 months prior to this, I still had a mask on, bandaged everywhere. I got onto the Skype conversation with her, and she immediately asked, she said, were you in a tank or an airplane? And I said, an airplane. She said, okay, I've had lots of friends that were burned. Let's get started. Last we ever talked about it. She didn't blink an eye, didn't care about the blood oozing out of my face and arms. And, I'd fall over on the couch and somebody'd have to pick me back up. She didn't care. We just dove into the Hebrew. And we started working 45 minutes 3 times a week. Then it was an hour and a half 3 times a week. She'd give me assignments in between. She was a fabulous tutor. Now, everybody else isn't going to necessarily learn from an Israeli, but I'd spent enough time in the military and had been an instructor in the military. I knew that the military instructor's 3 greatest tools are fear, sarcasm, and ridicule. Guess what? Her being from the IDF, she used the same 3 tools I was used to. My wife would walk in on one of these lessons and hear her screaming and yelling at me, think something was wrong, and I'm like, no, we're just communicating. That's how we do it. And so we became really good friends. I learned great from her, and things progressed. I was going to therapy, physical therapy every single day. And before this was all over, I went to physical therapy over 400 times. And there was very, very, very little progress, but it came in tiny spurts. I got from the point where I could move my hand about like this to when I could move it like this. That was a huge move. That was huge, and that took months. Well, we continued with this. I continued seeing doctors all over the country. I went to the Mayo Clinic. They said, there's no hope for you. They actually said, there's no hope. You need to get over this thought and get real with your life because this is what you're stuck with. Well, I continued to go to the Chabad classes. I continued to go schmooze with my buddy Dovey, that is the Chabad rabbi up here. And it seems kind of funny that, I talk about my buddy, but he is. And one day we're schmoozing and he said, you know what? We should call my mom. And I thought, I've been to the Mayo Clinic, I've been to the Grossman Burn Center, I've been to all these places all over the country, and we should call the rabbi's mom. What's she gonna do, give me chicken soup? I'm like, what can I lose? We'll call his mom. It turned out his mom was the head of the wound clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami. I got a hold of Pearl Shapiro. She said, Clark, send me pictures. So I sent her pictures, and I think she went to every surgeon on the East Coast till she found a guy that went, I think I can do something for him. I said, great. She said, I'll make you an appointment. He'll see you next Thursday. Fantastic. She said, you'll have to come stay by me. I didn't know what that meant, but I thought I'll find a hotel by them somewhere. I later found out that meant stay with them, but anyways. So I Skyped back in that next day with my tutor, Laron, from Tel Aviv. And I say, I've got some great news. And she said, that's fantastic. I've got some great news. And I said, well, she said, you go first. I said, the rabbi's mom found me a doctor that can do something, he thinks. I'm supposed to meet him on Thursday for him to look at me. She said, that's amazing. I got to tell you my news. I've been engaged to this guy in the US for the last 2 years. We're going to do a civil service and then do the big wedding in Israel this summer. And I said, when's the wedding? She said, it's amazing. It's on Thursday. And I said, that's fantastic. I said, where is it? And she said, Miami. And I said, that's where my doctor is. And she said, what time's your appointment? I said, 11 o'clock. She said, we're getting married at 1:30. I said, where are you getting married? And she told me. And so I got my iPad and I put it all in and I went, that's only 3 blocks from the hospital. She said, you've got to come to the wedding. I said, okay, great. I'll come to the wedding. So I went down to Miami, stayed with Rabbi's parents, who are just some of the greatest people you'll ever meet. Just fantastic. And Rabbi's mom, Pearl, said, I want to make sure you know where you're going tomorrow. So she took me over. We looked at where I was going. I found my way all over the world. If you just give me some latitude and longitude coordinates, I can put a bomb through somebody's window, no sweat. I don't need directions. But the rabbi's mom wanted to take me to the hospital and show me. I'll go with her and let her show me. So we did. I didn't know the next day I go in at 11 o'clock for my meeting. And at about 11, I make it 10:59. The door bursts open. Here comes Pearl Shapiro with an armful of papers. She's done research on stem cell lists and skin replacement. She's got research you won't believe. I'm like, wow. And she's like, where is the doctor? And I'm like, well, he's on round. She said, call him right now. She said, we've got places to be. I'm like, oh, goodness. I found out who really runs the place. It's not really the doctors. I think it's W's mom. So a few minutes later, here comes the doctor. He comes in. He's a man named Kumar Kadiyala, who's now the head of orthopedic surgery at Columbia University. He had gone to Stanford, and he came in. He looked at me for a minute, and he looked at my hands. Now, I have been to the Mayo Clinic, had them look at me for a minute and a half, charged $1,200, and say, there is no hope for you. This guy walked through the door, looked at me for a minute, and said, do I need to get it so you can hold the yoke on a Boeing or the side stick on an Airbus? And I went, you're my guy. You're my guy right there. Not this, there's no hope. He's like, which airplane are we shooting for here? He had done the research. He spent 40 minutes with me, and then Rabbi's mom was there the entire time. She's handing him this. What about this? What about this? Can we look at this? How about this? I've talked to this drug company. They're going to give him one of these. They're going to do this. They'll use him as a test subject. And he said, great. He said, I'm going on vacation for 2 weeks. He said, let's start this 2 weeks from Tuesday. And I went, I'm a year and a half into this. Everybody said there's no hope. I'll be back. American Airlines was giving me tickets to go back and forth, as well as my wife, who was still on a leave from United. She was practicing veterinary medicine here. We went down for the first surgery, and the second, and the third, and the fourth. And we had scheduled these things so tightly that I was just trying to get things done as quick as possible. So he said, come back in 2 weeks. I said, great. I was ecstatic. We thought there was hope. And I said, I've got to go to a wedding. So I walked from the hospital over to where Laron's wedding was going to take place at City Hall. And I'm just hanging out in the front of City Hall. No idea other than just this tiny screenshot of her face of who I'm waiting for. And I hear all this commotion out on the street. I couldn't tell if there was somebody was getting robbed, somebody died, if somebody got shot. And all it was an Israeli family walking down the street, communicating like they normally do, screaming and yelling. And they burst into the city hall and make all this noise. And they're like, Clark. So they said, let's go upstairs and get married. So I was one of the witnesses for the marriage. And they immediately adopted me and said, you have to come to the wedding in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem in June. I said, well, I'll be there. I don't know how, but I'll be there. So it motivated me even more to work harder on my Hebrew so I didn't get there and wouldn't be able to talk to anyone. So I worked even extra hard on the Hebrew. And after June, I had been through 3 or 4 of these surgeries. I think I'd been through 4 by then. We were doing them about every 6 weeks. And I made it to Jerusalem for the wedding. And by this point in time, I could actually hold the glass in one hand. My right hand had had a nerve cut in it, and it had just hung limp for about a year. And I finally was getting a little bit of movement in it. But my hands hadn't been reconstructed all the way yet. They looked a lot like oven mitts. So the doctor in Miami had started to put fingers back in here instead of it just being one piece. So what he had to do was literally cut in between here like you're cutting a steak, slice it open, then take skin from somewhere else and make this part of my fingers again. From going from just this paddle back to having fingers. And then we had to break loose all the joints with the physical therapy to make things move and teach my hands how to have synapses that fired again to make them work. So part of this, well, that's later part of the story. We go to Jerusalem, we spend 2 weeks, this wonderful wedding. And while we're there, she had told me her dad was some guy with a bank. He was a big guy. I didn't know who he was. He had just retired. He was the president of the 3rd largest bank in Israel. We're sitting at the family table with everyone at the front of the wedding. And I've got on the right side, I've got the mayor of Jerusalem at the time and the U.S. ambassador with me. Well, all the Israelis, were fantastic. They love me. They love military guys, especially fighter pilots. And they're telling me, Danny, they're telling you, Clark, I'm telling you, we have some of the best surgeons in the world here. We can fix you. If they can't do it, you've got to meet some of these people. So I stayed, talked to people. We had a great time, and I came home, continued working on the Hebrew, and I finally found one more guy that could do something with my right hand. Well, just about that time, the rabbi introduced me to another person who lived here in Flagstaff who never really was involved with the community. He called up, he needed a rabbi to help out with some papers he had for Israel for a will. The rabbi said, Clark, you've got to meet this guy. You're the only guy who really speaks around here, because I was working so hard on my Hebrew. He said, you've got to meet this guy. So I met him. We became immediate friends. He had been one of Israel's peace negotiators with Jordan and he's just a fantastic, wonderful, hardcore Israeli. He decided that he needed to work with me every day so that he said, you need to be able to do more than talk about the weather. He says, you need to be able to talk about science and literature and be able to talk about the Masur Matan, which is negotiations. So I became Yaakov Storch's new disciple, and he worked with me constantly. And Yaakov and I would spend 4 or 5 hours a day together. He decides, I've got a friend, I'm telling you, he's in Eilat, he's the head of surgery. He's got some funds. We've got to write him and tell him about you. So we wrote him, and he hooked me up with possibly the biggest burn surgeon in the entire world, a man named Yuval Krieger. And I started writing with Yuval Krieger, and he said, if you ever make it to Israel, he said, I don't know what I can do. I'll take a look. I'll see what I can do. So I visited with the one doctor in Austin who said he could do all these wonderful things for my hand. And I said, great, let's schedule this surgery up. He said, I can do you in a month. I said, let's do it. We immediately then flew over to Israel. I met with Dr. Krieger, and he said, so what is he going to do? He said, who's been writing me all of these letters in Hebrew? I said, that would be me. And he said, you write and speak? I said, yes. And he said, amazing. He said, let's take a look at your hands. He looked at it, he said, this is a piece of cake. He says, I do this stuff all the time. He said, I tell you what, he said, tell your doctor, he said, only do these things. He said, if he does all the things he wants to do, he says, you're going to lose your right hand. He said, it's not going to heal. You'll have problems. He said, you may lose up to about here. He said, it's going to be a disaster. Tell him to do exactly this. So he wrote down all the stuff. I went back to the American doctor, and the American doctor went, who is this guy? And he took the paper and he went, how did you get to see him? And I said, it's a long story. I said, but he only wants you to do this stuff. He said, okay, we'll do that stuff. This is the morning of surgery. We changed the whole plan. I go into surgery. At this point in time, this hand moves about 8 degrees. That's it. Dr. Krieger has him do all this stuff. While I'm on the table, the doctor takes my hand and he cranks it down to about 90 degrees of deflection. He tells my wife, we got him to 90 degrees, but it's never going to hold. Never. He said, if we get him to 45, OSHA will call him functional. Maybe he can do something. Okay, so I go to surgery, come out, wake up. They tell me this. They have me in therapy the next morning. We come back here to my hand therapist, who is another Jewish girl named Ariel Coffey. That's another story. She worked with me constantly when people said that it couldn't be done. We worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. I went back in 2 weeks for the recheck, and the doctor said, okay, let's see what you can do. And I went, and the doctor started crying. He said, I don't know where that came from. He said, I had nothing to do with that. He said, it's an absolute miracle. He said, you worked hard, but he said, I have no idea why you can do that. He said, I'm done. He said, I never thought we'd be able to do that. I'm like, well, I need a little bit more. He said, listen, Clark, he said, we're done. He said, he said, you should just be doing backflips for this. So I said, well, okay, we're done. And I thought, well, maybe we're not done. So I went back to Columbia University now, where Dr. Kadiala was, and he went, this is amazing. He said, I never thought we'd see this. He said, let's stop where we are, because he said, if we do anything else, you're going to lose function. He said, let's stop here. Meanwhile, I talked to American. They'd put me in a simulator. There were a couple things I still couldn't do with my right hand as the captain. So I called up Yuval Krieger one more time, and I talked to his receptionist named Iris. Asked her in Hebrew. I said, hey, I'm in New York right now. Can I come see Dr. Krieger one more time? She said, Clark, if you make it here, Dr. Krieger will see you. So I got on, about 4 hours later, I got on a United Airlines flight to Tel Aviv, rented a car, and I drove to Soroka Hospital in Beersheba to go see Dr. Krieger again. I saw him about 10 o'clock at night. He was doing rounds. And he said, Clark, let me see what you can do. And I showed him. And he's like, that's incredible. He said, I'm telling you. He said, we've got to show. He took me all over Soroka Hospital to show me to people. Look at what they can do. I'm telling you, this is unbelievable. So we sat back down in a room, and he said, what do you need to do? And I told him, I've got to be able to do this with my right hand. And he said, do you know who the enemy of good is? And I said, no. And he said, better. We can do better. I'm telling you. He said, I can do this right now. He said, but the insurance and all this crazy stuff. He said, tell you what, I've got a guy in America. We'll call him. If he can't do it, he says, you come back here, we'll figure it out. He said, besides, if we're here, he said, we're closer for divine intervention. So he calls up another world-renowned hand surgeon named Scott Levin at Penn. He's the director of surgery at Penn. He's the first person to do a bilateral hand transplant on a child who lost both hands. And they both work now. He calls this guy up that I'm not going to be able to see for years. He's like, Scott, it's Yuval. It's 10 o'clock at night now. It's 10 in the morning and 11 in the morning in Philadelphia. And he goes, Scott, I've got this guy here. He's a pilot. We've got to get him back in the cockpit. You got to see him. Okay, yeah, I'll tell him. He'll be there. Okay, Clark, you got to be there tomorrow morning. And there's a flight that leaves Tel Aviv in about 2.5 hours. You better hurry. I'm on my way. So I jump back in the car. I drive back to Ben Gurion, drop the car off, get on a flight, go to New York. From New York, I caught a train down to Philly, and I got there just in time for my appointment. Went to the appointment. Dr. Levin said, it's no problem. He said, I do this stuff all the time. He said, come back and see me next Thursday. He said, we'll get you back to work. It's been 5.5 years now. I come back the next Thursday. He does the surgery. Now, he wanted me to stay. All the other doctors had talked to my wife, who's got the doctorate of veterinary medicine and does surgery on every kind of animal in the world, including gorillas, which he says she likes doing surgery on better because they don't give her advice like I do. They never made me come back for rechecks. They would let my wife take out all the sutures at our dining room table with no anesthesia, and they'd watch. And when she'd get all done, they'd go, okay, it looks good. And they'd look and they'd ask, if there's any problems, Susie, Skype us, we'll talk to you. Well, Dr. Levin wanted me to stay. He takes out all the sutures 3 days later and goes, hey, Clark, go like this. And I go, he goes, hey, go back to work. I went back, immediately called one of the FAA doctors. They did a physical on me, sent all the stuff to Oklahoma City, and Oklahoma City then said, which is the big FAA medical place, we have to see you in a simulator to see everything. They sent me to a simulator in Dallas. Well, American Airlines, I called them up and said, hey, they say I need a simulator. They said, they were fantastic. They said, Clark, what do you need? We'll be there. I said, they said they can do it as soon as we can. This was the 31st of December, New Year's Eve. I can't believe the fleet manager picked up the phone on New Year's Eve. He said, I've got you scheduled for the morning of the 2nd, 7 a.m. I called the FAA, who still picked up the phone on New Year's Eve and said, we'll be there at 7 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd. I showed up. One of my buddies came along, and he actually had flown in the Air Force with my wife. He just came for moral support. He's another captain at American Airlines. Well, he sat down in the co-pilot's seat, and the FAA started talking to me, and they said, well, let's get started. And they looked at Reggie, my wife's friend, and my buddy, and said, you want to be his co-pilot? He said, sure, I've never flown this airplane, but I'll be his co-pilot. Not that Reggie doesn't have 25,000 hours of flying time in every Boeing airplane that's ever been built, like my wife. So he was a great guy to be there with me for support. The FAA had me do everything from the left seat, from the right seat. They had me pull every circuit breaker with each hand. They wanted to see me operate everything in the world on that airplane. They got all done, and then they said they were just going to have me just fly it around for a minute. They had me do engine failures, everything in the book. They got all done, and they said, well, Captain, welcome back. They said, I can't say for sure, but we're going to recommend that the medical department return you to flying status. I waited about 72 hours, and I got a phone call from the union that said they just got called from the back offices in the FAA that I'd been approved. They said, do you want us to get you off the sick list? And I said, please. I got a call back a few minutes later, and they said, we can't do it. You have to call the company's nurse and doctor and tell them. Well, I got a hold of the company's nurse in Dallas, and she said, do you remember me? She said, I talked to you 5.5 years ago when you were in a hospital bed. She said, I've been waiting for 5 years for this phone call. She said, you're off the sick list. I called up the chief pilot a couple minutes later, and he said, what do you want to come back as? I said, International Airbus captain out of Los Angeles. He said, done. Here, talk to payroll. They said, yeah, you're back on the payroll as of right now. They said, expect a call from training. About 20 minutes later, the phone call came from training. He said, hey, can you be here tomorrow? And I went, yeah. Called him back a couple minutes later and said, no, I don't even have a shirt that's not all carved up from all these surgeries. I got to go buy something, because I literally was having a surgery every few weeks trying to get. I finished up with 28 surgeries, 28 trips to the OR. Went back to American, and it was like it never changed. I did my first checkout flight after I was back and through all the simulator stuff. One of my F-16 buddies, that's one of our check pilots that I had checked out in the F-16, came and did my check ride. They returned me to flying status, and I've been back for the last almost 5 years. Ever since then, I still make all the JLI classes. I guess I'm the director of security here. I'm on the board. Me and the Rabbi talk sometimes 3 times a day, sometimes more, sometimes less, but we talk constantly. The rabbi's mom calls me more times than my mom does all the time. I'm so close to these people. It's more than family. So that's kind of the story. Uh, like I say, from a guy that you wouldn't have expected that from. And if I had not had this crazy idea or had not had this push from somewhere to learn to speak Hebrew, I never would have met any of these people. I'd still be sitting on the couch, um, not able to do any of this stuff. And I think I'm a pretty lucky guy.
Thank you, Clark, for sharing that. And I know that, at least this is what I was told, you actually don't share this story too often. So I really appreciate it. That's what I've been told. We're waiting for your book.
One of these days. One of these days.
Did anyone have any questions? I see a couple of microphones have been unmuted. Pinky, did you want to ask something?
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I have tears in my eyes. What an inspiration you are. And I look forward to your book.
And maybe meeting him. He comes down to Phoenix, Pinky.
Yeah, I think Dubby, Chaya, me and my wife are talking about going to Kitchen 18 tomorrow night.
Unfortunately, I would tell you you can come and stay in our spare room, but we're still in lockdown. So sorry about that. But God willing, next time.
Oh, thanks. We've actually got a condo down in Phoenix. Me and my wife are coming to and from work, and the rabbi and his wife and the family like that are about the ones we let use it. So pretty much the rabbi and the wife's bed is upstairs, and ours is the downstairs one.
Oh, how beautiful! Thank you so much.
Sure.
Morty,
That's an amazing story, Clark. It's an amazing story. God bless you for that. Where did you get that Jewish accent?
You know, I've been in trouble.
It's a perfect Jewish accent.
I just kind of meld into who I'm around. I got in trouble from the time I was in school. You know, teachers would think, "Are you making fun of me?" I'm like, no,
right.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Just, whatever you say, right. I just kind of
very good. Keep it up and have a long, good life.
Thank you.
Did anyone else have any questions? I'm looking at this. Oh, we've got something in the chat. Okay, so that was a tremendous inspirational story, and you do a great Israeli accent. Do you still have your crop dusting business?
No, we shut it down because I was doing everything. All my buddies still call me and say, "When are we going to open back up?" I'm like, "We're not." I miss it at times, you know, when I'm in, especially in the Midwest, or I'm down in the cotton fields because I grew up in the agricultural community. But I don't have enough body left to rebuild the other half of me. We've already used it up. We're running short on spare parts. So I think it's better just to do that. I've still got several airplanes. Me and my wife fly all over the place, have fun, and enjoy visiting people and going places. We still teach young kids how to fly. If a young kid comes to me and says he wants to be in the military service country and he wants to be a pilot, I've taught 19 of them to fly so far, and I just have them do things like sweep the floor up and wash the airplanes. Just, if you want to go serve, I'll help you out. So I still do some of that where I teach young kids how to fly. So does my wife. And no more spray business, but it'll always be in there.
I've got a question for you.
Sure.
That was obviously a single engine aircraft. Do you stay away from those because of that?
No. It could have happened any day, anywhere. You know, I went with the rabbi the other night when that young man was hit by the car. He stopped to help someone change a tire and got hit getting back into his car.
So for those of you who don't know about that, that was a Jewish, I think 4 people or 2 people driving cross country.
3 yeshiva students from New York.
That were driving cross country, and one of them was hit by a car just outside Flagstaff. So Rabbi Shapiro was called to help. If you're not familiar with Jewish traditions, is that they try to clean up the street from any parts to bury it as well. Yeah. So in New York, there are large organizations that take care of this. but when they're out in the middle of Arizona, Rabbi Shapiro has done this more than once.
Yeah. It happened middle of the night. My phone went off. Dovey's one of the few phones that I let ring through all night, him, my wife, a couple other people. And he said, yeah, my wife's uncomfortable with me going up on the, to the middle of nowhere at 2:00 in the morning by myself. I said, well, I'll go with you. So I did. But everybody thinks they're in control of everything. I can tell you, you're not. You can do your best, but you're not. As far as airplanes, my wife got me home from the rehab hospital, and the very next day, she helped shove me into the back seat of one of our airplanes, and I went and flew that airplane the day I got out of the hospital. Now, I couldn't hold onto the stick. It was just kind of like this, but I got right back in, and don't have a problem with it. I've got a good friend that's an Israeli fighter pilot. He was burned in '73, named Aviram Cohen. Aviram was burned from the back up. I was burned from the front down. We joke about between the two of us, we make one full person. But Aviram and I have both said, when people have asked us, if you'd known that was going to happen, would you have not gone to work that day? And we both look at each other and go, I don't know, I'm not done yet. Of all the people I've met, the experiences, my connection now to the Torah, I think I could live without the pain, but I don't think I'd want to trade that. So that's just kind of my outlook on it.
Just one other angle on this question for you. Your wife obviously was a rock in this, but trauma for her from it, because she's also a pilot, did it cause anything for her?
Between the two of us, no. It was definitely hard on her because she had to do everything while I was laid up, and the hospital immediately puts a lien on your house and everything else, until the insurance is squared away when you're talking about bills of this magnitude. But no, she climbs back in airplanes, has no problem. Probably tomorrow night when we fly down to the valley, or if we go up to Vegas, she's already called it for the first leg. She'll fly the first one out and I'll fly it back. We still split everything. She, right down the middle. She's amazing. So, and through all of this too, we found the connection also for her. She comes to the Chabad GLI classes now too, and Shabbat dinners whenever she's home. Her mom died when my wife was 5 years old of cancer, and her mom found a lady named Hirschberger to take care of the 3 kids until her dad got remarried. Well, her dad got remarried to a lady that was not just an atheist, actually hated God. So there was no talk of anything, nothing. She immediately fired Mrs. Hirschberger. There was never a word said about anything. Well, a couple of years ago, my wife's dad passed away right after this woman did, his wife. And as they were going through my wife's mom's belongings that were still packed in a box, they found a menorah and a few other Jewish things. Susie had a DNA test done and found out that her mom's side Jewish. Then she started to put 2 and 2 together, since there was no contact with really people from her mom's side. She finally tried to get a hold of her mom's sister and get the story of the family, and by then she had Alzheimer's, and her husband had passed away. But she had married a man named Ron Hirschberger, who was a professor at Harvard, and we start to see there was a pretty large connection on my wife's side. So she enjoys coming now, and yeah, she enjoys it.
Thank you again for sharing this story. This is just an inspiration for us as well, and just to see God's blessings in your life and how God leads people, which is amazing to see. Sometimes we don't get to see the dots connect. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, and hope I didn't go over on the time.
No, the time was great. Thank you. It was perfect.
Okay.
I just want to mention for those of you that are still on tomorrow, because everything is coronavirus, of course. We have a pharmacist who will be talking tomorrow about one of the, I'm going to say, more known drugs, possibly controversial is a good word, not possibly, is a good word, hydroxychloroquine. So she's going to talk about the pros and the cons that you find in the news, or maybe that you don't find in the news. And I'm not sure if she's really reading up on all the research over the last 2 days. Where, one study came out that it was terrible, which is why France stopped using it. And then they say that that study is flawed. So as everything goes with politics these days, sadly, we thought medicine was excluded. But I am very much looking forward. She is a professor of pharmacology. Thank you, Pinky, for putting that out there. So she's also taught it. She researches it. And I'm looking forward to that. Again, that is Dr. Carrie Lifshitz. So that is tomorrow at 12:30. And again, thank you, Clark, so much for today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.